How America Took Out the Nord Stream Pipeline. It looks at one of the great mysteries of the past year. Who is behind the bombing of the Nord Stream pipelines, which were built to carry natural gas from Russia to Europe? The pipelines were severely damaged last September in a series of underwater explosions in the Baltic Sea. In his new piece, Seymour Hersh cites an unnamed source who says the sabotage was carried out by the U.S. Navy, which planted remotely triggered explosives during NATO exercises last September. Hersh reports the Biden administration began planning the act of sabotage in December 2021, 2 months before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. On February 7th, 2022, President Biden held a joint news conference with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, and Biden brought up the future of the Nord Stream pipeline.
Invades. That means tanks or troops crossing the border of Ukraine again. Then there will be no longer a Nord Stream 2. We will bring an end to it.
How will you do that exactly, since the project and control of the project is within Germany's control?
We will, I promise you we'll be able to do it.
I'll promise you we'll be able to do that. Well, Seymour Hersh reports U.S. Navy divers planted remotely triggered explosives on the pipelines in June while NATO was conducting military exercises in the area. He reports the divers were all members of the Navy and not members of America's Special Operations Command, whose covert operations must be reported to Congress. Then, on September 25th, 2022, a Norwegian surveillance plane dropped a sonar buoy, which triggered the C4 explosives that had been placed on the pipeline. Soon after the explosion, the United States strongly suggested Russia was behind blowing up its own pipeline. In December, the New York Times reported Russia had begun expensive repairs on the pipelines, a move which has raised questions about Western claims that Russia had bombed its own pipelines. Meanwhile, some Biden officials have publicly praised the fact that the pipeline was blown up. This is Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs Victoria Nuland speaking during a recent Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearing.
I am, and I think the administration is very gratified to know that Nord Stream 2 is now, as you like to say, a hunk of metal at the bottom of the sea.
We're joined now by Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Seymour Hersh to talk more about his new piece, How America Took Out the Nord Stream Pipeline. If you can flesh out what it is you found in your report and what first tipped you off, albeit there were a lot of public comments, including the Polish government right after the bombing saying, "Thank you, America." Lay it out for us, Cy.
Well, first of all, I think the reporting really can be described as a friend of mine did. What I did was really deconstruct the obvious. I mean, you have to hear what the president said. But of course, there were secret plans that I'm writing about, and they include there was a committee set up. Jake Sullivan was directly involved. He was the national security advisor, still is. They set up a team to look at options about how to put pressure on the Russian government to back off. I'm getting a bounce in my ears, so this is comical. Can you hear me?
We hear you perfectly. We don't hear the bounce, Si.
Oh, okay, that's great. I hear it, though. Anyway, and so there was I'm just writing about inside baseball stuff. It's the normal things you do. They set up a committee to think of options. Russia was clearly going to go. The threat the president had yet to make had not been made, and this is December before New Year's Day of the year before, 2021. And the question inside the committee, and it included the usual CIA, NSA, Treasury Department, State Department, you name it, and they met in a secret office building in the across the street from the White House, the executive office building. The option was, do you want us to do something kinetic, or something not kinetic? In other words, not kinetic would be more sanctions, or something kinetic would be, taking out the pipeline, as had been thought about. And an answer came pretty quickly. I would guess Victoria Nuland's statement that you mentioned came actually before the president's. It came in late January of last year. And that statement came, at that time, I think the committee involved, a lot of sophisticated people in the intelligence and operation community, concluded you could do it, and the White House was told it was possible. I think that led to the comments, which really, of course, made the people on the inside go half crazy because it was supposed to be completely covert. But at that place, as I wrote, it was simply described as a classified operation. None of the rules of reporting to Congress were involved. And so they began their planning. They went to Norway, which is a great ally of ours. Norway was one of the original signers of the 1949 NATO treaty. I think 19 nations were involved then. And Norway is a great ally. We have spent, I write about this in some detail in the article, hundreds of millions, probably more, closer to $1 billion or more, upgrading facilities. Norway has a 1,400-mile border along the Atlantic coast that goes from Oslo in Europe all the way up north it runs into the Russian border in above the Arctic Circle. So we put a lot of facilities up north there. Synthetic aperture radar, which costs a fortune to monitor the Russian nuclear sites around, and also their military activities around there, up in the other side of the peninsula, in the Kola Peninsula. So they're just our guys, and they're also great at doing underwater stuff. And so that's what happened. We did a plan with them. We had to clear it with Sweden and Denmark. I'll leave it to them to decide whether that they were accepted the explanation we were doing exercises in the Baltic Sea for the hell of it. But so far, I haven't seen much from either of them. And, you know, it's a tiresome game to me. And so what happens is when I do my story on Substack, I wouldn't even think, I'm embarrassed to say it after all those wonderful years I had at the New York Times, I wouldn't even think of taking a story like this to the New York Times. They've decided that the Ukraine war is going to be won by Ukraine, and that's what its readers get, and so be it. That's their call. So I just did my reporting, and the miners came from a very facility in a little small town in Florida, and the mining community in the Navy is very secret, and they just do their business. They don't talk. That was perfect people to get, and they practiced it. And as you said, there was a major exercise every summer by the Sixth Fleet, which American Sixth Fleet out of Italy, which also has the operational rights in the Baltic Sea. Baltic Sea is a huge place. The pipelines we're talking about, Nord Stream 1, which came alive in 2011, and Nord Stream 2 was actually done, but the Germans that are ready to pump has 750 miles, and they go straight from Russia, which is loaded with all kinds of gas. They're in Siberia. They have enormous reserves directly into Germany. And I can tell you, Nord Stream 1 was a godsend for the German economy and Western Europe. They produced so much gas at such low prices that the German government was actually able to resell some of the gas the Russians were providing at a profit without Russia objecting. And so the German economy is huge, it's booming. You know, the cars we know about, Germany has the largest chemical company in the world, BASF, and everybody's right now. It's hell to pay. It's gotten very cold there. There's a lot of anger, and anyway, the purpose.
Hersh, so I wanted to ask you in terms of the lack of it always seemed to me when the claims were that potentially Russia had sabotaged its own pipeline, that it was ludicrous to think that that would be so, that they would invest so much money in pipelines and then bomb them themselves. But I'm interested in the lack of press attention since the sabotage occurred, and also the lack of congressional attention. I think back to the CIA's mining of the Managua harbors back in the early 1980s under the Reagan administration, when the conservative Republican head of the Senate Intelligence Committee Barry Goldwater objected and raised concerns that this was a covert operation where Congress was not notified. And then, of course, Congress cut off aid to the Contras. As a result, there was an International Court of Justice ruling against the United States. But in this case, this kind of sabotage, the media seems not to be at all interested in finding out what happened here, as you have, and Congress, there's no one in Congress that's been raising questions.
You listened to the newscast that we just heard as the show opened. One horrible event after another. I think the world's taken a very bizarre turn. I also, it doesn't matter what I think. There's no question there's been a polarization of the press since Trump got in. We're now on two sides, right, left, Democrat, Republican, however you describe it. If you watch Fox News, you don't watch MSNBC, et cetera, et cetera. And if you read the New York Times, you're not going to get what the right winger, the conservatives have been after the New York Times and Washington Post for their quote unquote liberal view. So we've got a polarization going, and at this time we've got a Democratic president that has done some good stuff domestically, but I can tell you I'm not understanding the total commitment to Ukraine, and I'm not understanding what I read, because obviously I have access to a lot of people who see things. I've been doing this, Amy, and I've been doing this, writing about COVID activities for, am I that old? 300 years. Anyway, the bottom line is the stories I've been getting about the war, particularly beginning in fall, and that's what gets interesting, have been pretty dire. The Russians, I think the end is just a question of time. Right now, it's a question of how many more people Zelensky wants to kill of his own people. It's going to be over. What happened is the plan was to put the bomb, and I can't answer your philosophical question about why Congress isn't doing anything anymore. Congress is pretty much polarized just as much. And there's also an enormous continuing hatred of all things Putin in this country, which is foreign policy disagreements are one thing, but it's very personal here, and that's not useful. But anyway, the other, I don't think there's any chance that Putin wants to take over Europe. I don't think he wants to have Ukraine tamed, but he's not interested in doing anything more. But I may be in a minority about that. Anyway, what happens is there was an exercise in June, and it was supposed to. The bombs were put in there under the cover of a NATO exercise. There were a lot of different countries running around with divers and blowing up things. It was an exercise to go find and chase mines. There never had been one before. It actually was whoever in the CIA or the other agencies that thought this up should get a bow, because it was pretty ingenious. So in that exercise, the divers went down, did what they were trained to do. They're very good. C4. A couple hundred, whatever the weight is, bombs enough to blow up most cities, most buildings in Washington, and some in New York. Anyway, they did their job, but the president at the last minute hesitated because he was afraid blowing it up right after the exercise would put the finger at us, and then he wanted permission to do it anytime, and that caused an enormous trouble in the team. The team was, people are sophisticated in the intelligence services. I know we have cliches about them. We see the movies about them. And the bottom line is this made sense of them blowing up a pipeline, it's actually owned by a division of Gazprom owns 51%. That's all the Russian oligarchs. And 49% of the Nord Stream 1 are owned by 4 business groups in the Western Europe who farm out the oil. Anyway, they saw the threat as being valid. And if he wanted to do it during an exercise, well, okay. But in late September, they got the word, they fixed it so he could. But then they thought it was, I don't know what they thought, but I don't think they thought in late September he would blow up the main pipeline, Nord Stream 2, which is a new one that had been just built. And it had been sanctioned. It had gas in it. That's why so much leaks. 750 miles of methane gas were sitting in it. But it had been sanctioned by the German government. And so when he did that, here's what Biden did. And this is what I think the ultimate point of the story, and why so many people, even the intelligence community, are very troubled by it. What he did is he said, I'm in a big war with Ukraine. It's not looking good. I want to be sure I get German and West European support. And I know winter's coming, and if it's going to be bad, I don't want the Germans to say we got to check out because we're getting massacred. We'll be massacred with no cheap fuel, and our economy will go bonkers. We're going to check out, and we're going to open up the gas line, which they could do. So he took away that option, and what that has done, as you know, America has been talking about ever since the first pipeline, Nord Stream 1, came online in 2011, and there were years before it was being built. This goes back to the Bush-Cheney years, and as you know, I did a lot of reporting for the New Yorker on those people, that particular gaggle. Anyway, and at that time they began to talk about the threat, the threat of gas, the threat of cheap energy for Europe, would always seen as a threat to make Europe be more palatable or more willing to trade with Russia. We always wanted to isolate Russia. This has been a theme of the last decades.
Well, Cy, but can I ask you also, there are several people, obviously you've gotten criticism at times for many of your exposés, but there are some people who are saying that this particular expose does not have a whole lot of documentation, that it essentially relies on one source one internal source, anonymous source of yours. How do you respond to those criticisms that this is much less documented than previous exposés of yours?
I'll get to that, but let me finish my thought because it's a very important thought. The fear was Europe would pass away, walk away from the war. And now what he's done, and you have to lift it up a little bit. There you go. There. Now what he's done is he's told Europe, you're second rate. And I think the consequences of this for the Europeans are going to be horrific. This has cut into the notion that they can depend totally on America, even in a crisis. And I think it's going to undercut NATO, which I always found to be supremely useless. But certainly the European countries are going to be, I know people that are paying 5 times as much now for electricity. People are paying 3 or 4 times more for gas. There's not enough of it. It's very expensive. It's colder now than it was in the fall. They had a light fall because of climate change, if you want to believe it or not. And anyway, I think the consequences politically for us are enormous. I think the reason that Biden and his people in the White House have denied the story and continue to deny it and get accepted by some of the press, my old newspaper, the New York Times. I don't know why they're not doing more reporting on this instead of relying on a denial and walking away from the story. Ditto for the Washington Post. I think the consequences politically for us in the long run, looking at even potential some countries walking out of NATO. If that's what he thinks, that our being cold is less important than him keeping a war going that he's not going to win, it strikes me. As for the source question, I've been doing this so long. I'm not bothered by the fact that the government attacks me and that my old newspaper, the New York Times, hasn't written a word about it. I find it sort of, that's where we are. That's why people like me are in Substack. It's a self-publishing thing. I don't have to worry about censorship or second thoughts. But I don't talk about sources. I just, I'm lucky. I've had for 20 or 30 or 40 years people inside who not only are faithful to what they're doing, but also are not afraid to be critical of it. And so that's the kind of source that, reporters, dream about. And I've had people like that for forever, and I still do. And so there's been a lot of criticism. One of the things I will get to your point about criticism, one of the criticisms of the open source people, OSINT, it's a very big part of the world now. There are people that monitored air traffic and boat traffic and all that. And there's some 2 or 3 different groups have produced statements saying that none of the things they see tracks with my story. And I would say about that, if you're in the intelligence community and you were running covert ops for years and you're in Norway, we're working very closely with the Norwegians on this, who, by the way, have increased their production of oil to Europe by doubled it. It was, I don't know the exact numbers, but it's gone up at least double, maybe even more than that, 2.5 times as much now without the pipeline. But certainly, the first thing you look at is how to take care of open source people, make them think what happened isn't happening. I mean, that's so obvious to me, but not to them. Secretary of State Tony Blinken, after the bombing in September, he made a speech in which it was a press conference in which he made a gratuitous statement. He said, One good thing is that no more will Russia be able to weaponize gas. And the notion of Russia weaponizing gas with Western Europe to get fame and to diminish our power over or our authority or our economic ability, control over Western Europe has been a theme of this country for 2 decades. It's not a new theme. Oil scares the hell. Russian oil and gas always scared the hell out of Washington. Now your question is still.
Yeah, and lastly, the Norwegian government has claimed that one of the ships that you mentioned in your article that was involved in the planning of this or preparation of this was not present at the time of these exercises. What do you make of Norway's denial?
The Norwegian government that's just completely. I'm sorry. I dropped something here. The government, not only did that ship have was in the operation, it also have a compression chamber that had been flown in by the CIA. Now I'm getting the details I don't want to bother with. The CIA flew in a compression chamber that's put on the ship because it's just a submarine hunter. And the divers at 260 feet, that's the level. The Norwegians found the lowest level, the shallowest part of the Baltic Sea. Which is off an island called, it's between Sweden and Denmark. And they practiced there. They had to. And for the divers, it was 260 feet deep where the landlines were. And the pipelines are steel covered, but they're also covered by concrete shields. So it's a serious job to blow them up. And at 260, without a compression chamber, they'd have to go up every 90 feet. They're breathing, it's amazing to me, they're breathing oxygen, nitrogen, and helium. That's pretty amazing to me. And they'd have to go up now they could just pop up to the surface. So it was called the Alta. The ship was there. I mean, that's just such a stupid lie. But it's a submarine hunter. They didn't have to stay there. They could just go and the guys could jump off. And there was no long recovery. At a certain time, they would come up, and the time was fixed. You don't drop explosives like that and then let them go off in 5 minutes. You give a lot of time. You have a timer on it so that the divers could get up to the top, and they come up and they make a pickup. It could happen much more quickly than you think because it's not in the description of the ship, but on that ship there was a decompression chamber. It had been flown in and planted there. By the CIA. This was actually a brilliant operation, if you want to know it from the point of view of a classic operation, because they got away with it. And at that point, the purpose was always, let me go back to this, the purpose for doing it is to make the threat credible. But then you have the president and the undersecretary of state within a weeks or two of getting a word that it's credible, we can do it. Start blabbing about it. Of course, that was disillusioning to the people involved, but so what? I can't talk about it. You can say it's not true, I invented it, but that's just, look, he did it, and he's going to have up to it. I watch my mail. I watch my Gmail, and I'm seeing every day more and more than I want. I'm seeing more messages from around the world, different countries streaming in. I'm seeing that. I'm seeing something that was, and by the way, on Substack, it was, I didn't know about Substack. It's an amazing platform. They had more than 1 million hits on the thing within a day. Well, I mean, people, what were the messages I got from people who said, thank God we missed the kind of reporting that you and others have done. We don't see it anymore. I'm not talking about your show, Amy. I guarantee you, not that.
Well, Seymour Hersh, we want to thank you so much for being with us. The Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist will link to your new piece on your Substack, How America Took Out the Nord Stream Pipeline.